Hello, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are on this beautiful planet of ours. Welcome to Sustainability in Your Ear. This is the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society, and I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Thanks for joining the conversation today. Disinformation and distraction are everywhere. That's our subject today. And they're not just problems of social media, partisan politics, or algorithmic rabbit holes. From climate debt traps to the hidden dangers of gas stoves, from the greenwashing of net zero pledges to the global risks that children face due to water insecurity, entire swaths of critical information go unreported or underreported every year, not because the facts are unavailable, but because the incentives of media ownership and advertising discourage deep structural coverage of the challenges that our industrial economy represents. So it's a pleasure to welcome back to the show Andy Lee Roth, editor at large of Project Censored. Since 1976, the organization has tracked and amplified vital stories that the corporate press has failed to cover. He's also the co-editor of Project Censored's annual book series and has written extensively on the intersections of media, democracy, and power. And he returns to the show to talk about the collaborative process that he has participated in, involving students and faculty from more than 24 colleges and universities that work to surface some of the most censored stories in the world each year. And today, we'll be talking with Andy about the top censored stories of 2023 and 2024, with a special focus on environmental and climate reporting. We'll explore what's happening to society when essential truths get buried, and about who benefits from the silence and how independent journalism is pushing back against systematic neglect. You can learn more about Andy and Project Censored at projectcensored.org. Project Censored's all one word, no dash, no space, projectcensored.org. We'll get to the conversation right after this quick commercial break. Welcome back to the show, Andy. How are you doing?
Well, that's a tough one to answer these days, Mitch, but overall I'm doing okay and looking for the silver linings and the opportunities as we face every day kind of new wrinkles in the ongoing cascade of stories about the dismantling of important environmental regulations and the gutting of important environmental science research. So these are challenging times, but myself and my Project Censored colleagues are fully committed to the idea of, it's important to talk about the news that didn't make the news.
Well, and I think that's incredibly important. And so let's cover a few of those stories. But before we start, I want to ask a question about what you just referred to, the momentous year that we are in the midst of. How do you think that independent media is doing in the face of what is pretty obviously rising authoritarianism?
Yeah. Yes, to the latter, pretty obviously, with all the implications of it. So you and I are talking the day after masked ICE officials came to arrest a graduate student for writing an op-ed piece. And we're talking in the context of what folks at Reporters Without Borders have been describing as every day opening President Trump is opening new fronts on his war on the press. Um, so
We're going to make it?
sorry.
Are we going to make it?
Yeah, I think we are, because I mean, what I will say, and I knock wood as I say it, is I believe we're in a kind of a golden era for independent media and independent journalism, especially online.
Mhm.
Um, and so there are organizations responding to kind of what's been happening since the November election. Organizations of independent journalists. So I'm thinking, for instance, of the Movement Media Alliance, which is being spearheaded by folks at Truth Out, among others, to bring together so that to bring together independent news outlets, independent journalism, independent newsrooms to work together in coordination with one another to respond to some of these extraordinary challenges that we're facing. So um, you the idea, of course, is that we always have had independent news outlets covering stories and doing the work that independent journalists and journalism does. But now the idea is, hey, in the face of these challenges, we have to organize. We have to be organized ourselves. And so we're having internal discussions at Project Censored about how we can be best prepared. Hopefully, we aren't facing ICE agents in masks coming after us for things we've written about the Trump administration over the years. But I think, it sounds like a cliche in certain contexts, but the idea of solidarity, the idea of linking arms and working together is a crucial response to the current challenges.
Let's look back before we start talking about some of the stories you've uncovered. How did Project Censored get started? I mean, it seems so incredibly relevant now, but tell us the story about how we got here and how you pick these stories.
Yeah, just a quick version of the story, because it's a nearly 50-year long story now, but it begins at Sonoma State University in Northern California, part of the California State University system, where Carl Jensen, who was a former advertising and journalism guy, was teaching a class around the time of the Watergate investigations and the re-election of Richard Nixon. And a student asked Carl how it could be that on election night, when Nixon won re-election, not a single one of the major news networks covering the election mentioned Watergate. And the question intrigued Carl, and he began thinking about more broadly um, the kinds of stories that weren't getting reported. And that launched what now is the students who helped identify and vet and summarize the stories in this year's yearbook, State of the Free Press 2025, are the 49th cohort of undergraduate students now at campuses, college and university campuses across the country, not just at Sonoma State, who have been digging these stories from independent sources and comparing them for their corresponding or lack of corporate news coverage, and then summarizing them in sort of bite-sized chunks that people who are busy and perceive themselves as, oh, I don't have time to really be a news junkie. Well, a short summary is something you can digest in, a few minutes. And if you're intrigued, the sources are there for people to go dig deeper. So it's, we're going on our 50th anniversary is coming up next year in 2026. And all along, the goal has been to champion independent journalism and to, as we say, to kind of bring wider public attention to news stories that are deserving of that attention but haven't gotten the spotlight from the establishment press.
Well, it's fitting that it should be the 50th anniversary of Project Censored on the 250th anniversary of the nation's founding, which, of course, was, amongst other things, predicated on a free press.
Yeah.
Uh,
Carl was a former advertising guy, and so the idea that he was launching Project Censored in 1976, the bicentennial year, he knew what he was doing. And you can see all kinds of things that where Carl's sensibility as an advertising and a media guy, and not just a professor, influenced sort of how the project, he picked the name Project Censored because he knew it would be a puzzler for people, right? It would raise questions. What do you mean Project Censored? What's been censored? Right?
mhm.
That's a lightning rod issue. And so a lot of people will say to us, like, you know, almost 50 years later, censorship? What do you mean by censorship? Right? And so we'll talk about, for instance, that, we need a modern 21st century definition of censorship that goes beyond what might have been historically the concerns around First Amendment, protections of press freedom, which are very much a concern today. But also the idea that, censorship, we need to be concerned not just about censorship from governmental sources, but censorship by corporate entities and interests as well.
So we're going to concentrate on some of the stories that are environmentally focused, and unfortunately, a lot of them are. But let's start with the first. That's the backtracking by companies about their net zero commitments. And this was reported by Taylor Connolly the environmental magazine in February of 2024. That's what you're pointing to as an example of this kind of coverage. What do you think the mainstream press risks by failing to really interrogate the legitimacy of these corporate net zero claims?
Mm. Well, one way to answer that question is to say, like, let's open up and reconsider whether we want to even talk about the mainstream press as the mainstream press.
Okay.
Why aren't we getting corporate news coverage of corporations backing down on their net zero promises? So this is a story about how corporations are kind of strutting in front of the spotlight when there are opportunities to boast and brag about their commitments to the environment and their commitments to addressing the climate crisis. But then in reality, when the hard work is there to be done, or the profits are perhaps compromised by those pronounced commitments, is a different story. So the environmental magazine, Conley, who you mentioned, reports less than 4% of the 1,000 companies that Net Zero Tracker has tracked are doing the bare minimum to be considered in line with the goals from the 2015 Paris agreements. The rest of the companies weren't even meeting the so-called starting line criteria that were laid out then. So this is an abysmal failure overall. But again, I want to go back and say, let's not talk about the mainstream media. Let's talk in
Mhm.
this case about this being the corporate news media. And as corporate news media, the news coverage they produce reflects a corporate worldview and often promotes corporate interests. And so a story about corporate failure is just the kind of story that, you might expect, oh, this is going to get soft pedaled or downplayed or not covered at all. And indeed, that's what we found when we investigated this story, um, that you will find extensive coverage about, net zero campaigns, but the net zero tracker study about companies walking back their climate commitments was was covered hardly at all in
Yeah.
the establishment press. And I
So
think again that reflects this kind of the way that what we think of as sort of mainstream news typically reflects a corporate worldview.
one of the challenges of reading a lot of independent writing, however, is being able to fact check those sources as well. And we know that there's a lot of coordinated effort to spread misinformation. What kind of media literacy skills do people need to develop in this era in order to distinguish between, a real commitment to make a reduction and greenwashing, for instance?
I mean, I think one thing that people can do that is sort of critical media literacy 101 is look at the sources of the story that you're engaged with, right? So if it's a broadcast story, look at who is speaking in the sound bites. If it's a print story, look at who the quoted sources are, and whose interests do they represent, right? And so if you see a story based on, if you see a story about net zero commitments by corporate entities and every quoted source is a corporate spokesperson, your critical media literacy antenna might start buzzing and you might start thinking, hey, I wonder if this is really a multi-perspectival story or not. Is there a critical edge in this story?
One of the things you need to be aware of too is that a lot of, particularly on the conservative side, organizations have set up false fronts, think tanks
Yeah.
with apparently benign sounding titles, which have a very authoritarian bent. How do you identify those amongst all those spokespeople that might be quoted in a story?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that's good, right? We're now imagining the kind of the steps we might take if
Yep.
we were reading a story and we wanted to kind of assess for ourselves, like how narrow or broad is the range of perspective reflected in this story. And so looking back at, okay, look, who is the source? I think in general, it's good to be skeptical of, and it's good to be skeptical of anyone identified with an organization like characterized as being a think tank, right? Because as
Mhm.
you point out, Mitch, like a lot of those organizations are like fronts for political agendas and ideology. And so, but that again, like I mentioned, we're in this kind of golden age of media. Our ability to do, what in media literacy circles gets called lateral reading, right? Instead of reading further in this story, we open a
Mhm.
new tab or window on our browser and we check out, well, who is this person?
Yeah.
What is this heritage foundation that I'm hearing presented as a kind of a scholarly institution committed to objective analysis of facts? Does that check out? And again, that takes more time to do
Mhm.
those things. But eventually, I think if you do that systematically, you start to begin to kind of understand, well, what are some of the creatures moving around in this media ecosystem? And who do these creatures ally themselves with? And how do they function in that system? And you
Yeah.
begin to get a kind of a lay of the land that makes it so that you're not kind of researching everything from scratch every time. You start seeing, as I love talking about at Project Censored, you start seeing patterns in the coverage.
Mhm.
And I'm a sociologist by training, so all my instinct and professional training is to look for these underlying patterns. I love talking about how at Project Censored, every story that we cover each year, like this net zero story from the 2025 yearbook, is important in its own right, but that over a span of nearly 50 years now, with 25 stories a year, we have a fairly large data set of the kinds of stories that corporate news media are either ignoring or covering in a partial way, in both senses of that term. And you can start to see these patterns of the kinds of stories that either get covered in a that either get coverage or don't get coverage, or they get this kind of partial, incomplete, potentially biased coverage. And these patterns become over time, like I think, fairly clear. And again, what we've done organizationally, Project Censored has been around since, before I cared about the news or politics, when baseball was what mattered to me. But what the project can do kind of institutionally and organizationally, people can also do on their own individually, which is that as you begin tracking stories, thinking critically about them, you can see these patterns. You come to see these patterns.
Yeah, at Earth911, we do try to include links out so that you can learn more, particularly to research if we make a claim about some kind of impact that you can have by making a change in your lifestyle. But this also raises a challenge for any corporate journalist is, you want to keep them on your site. You don't want to send them off to find that ancillary source that's going to allow them to validate it. And so to a degree, the way that the writing and production of news in the corporate media functions, you're being enclosed in a silo of that publication's content.
Yes, that definitely happens. I mean, that's not, I think, a problem on the Project Censored website. If you come and look at, say, the net zero story and our coverage of it, the most of the links are outside to the sources that originally broke and reported the story.
Yeah.
But you're right, there are, you know, fundamental economic incentives in a lot of, on a lot of online content to keep people in house, right? And we're seeing this more and more. I would add, um, this isn't specific to any subject area or kind of social issue, but the way search works and the way algorithms that drive search engines works is organized in very similar ways, right? And so that's a distortion of the kind of free flow of information to promote kind of financial interests of the host of the search engine and that occurs in ways that are often invisible to the people using the search engine or whatever the technology is.
There's a whole lot we can dig into there, but I want to move on to the next story. Well, I'm sure we're going to get back to it. So the second story that you covered, Common Dreams reporter Olivia Rozan described the slow progress by the United Nations on ending deforestation by 2030, which is a UN goal. As we pull back into our protectionist bubbles all around the world, How are we going to encourage the kind of global journalistic effort that might improve transparency and accountability on something like deforestation or reforestation goals?
Yeah, I mean, I think a couple kinds of answers to that question. One is, I think, an old-fashioned answer: follow the money, right? Journalism that follows the money. In this case, I'll rattle off some figures here. I won't, hopefully, won't rattle them too quickly. But part of the Forest Declaration assessment uh, that we're talking about in this story is down to numbers and finance. Um, One of the findings was that to kind of the funding necessary to protect and restore the world's forests would amount to about $460 billion per year in green financing. But every year between 2013 and 2018, national governments had spent up to between 378 and 635 billion in so-called gray financing. Gray meaning that it had clear harmful impacts on forests. And the amount that's being spent per year to protect, conserve, and restore forests was a mere $2.2 billion. So this massive disproportion or this massive gap between the necessary budget and the actual budget, and then as the kicker on it, massive spending of this so-called gray funding that's actually detrimental to the restoration and protection of the remaining forests. So I think, one thing that journalism has always been good at doing is, a certain kind of journalism, maybe it's a sort of muckraking journalism, is to follow the money and the interests and the interconnections. And I think, a doubling down on old-fashioned commitments to seeking the truth and reporting it, as the Society of Professional Journalists talks about, is still fundamentally a good compass to follow. The other thing I would say in terms of how we can have better reporting on these issues comes down to a point made by Gay Tuckman, pioneering sociologist of the news in the late 1970s. Gay Tuckman wrote a book called Making News, about the social construction of news stories, as sociologists are inclined to. And one of the key distinctions that she made was the difference between events and issues. And I
Mhm.
think stories like this, you can see why they get shunted aside and why they don't get well covered. Journalism, Tuckman said, was really good at covering events, right? If there's a dramatic occasion, journalists know how to cover that. So,
Yeah.
this morning, one of the headlines is that a kind of a tourist submarine off the coast of Egypt in the Red Sea sank. That's a like an easy dramatic event for a reporter to cover. But something that happens every day that's a slow building or slow disintegrating process is much like it poses challenges for reporters, it poses challenges for readers of that reporting. And so if we're talking about something kind of abstract, like ending deforestation by the year 2030, it's an issue that matters in deep fundamental ways, as everyone who listens to Earth 911 already understands, I think. But it's not an issue that has immediate hooks to say this story matters right now and it should matter every day moving forward.
You mentioned muckraking earlier, and muckraking journalism evolved in the time of William McKinley, the president's current hero. It is fitting that it seems to be coming back in response to the repeat of the McKinley administration. Now,
And it's especially just to add on to that, like it was a response to Gilded Age robber barons and
yeah,
whatnot. And right, we have our new kind of techno plutocrats now, some of whom today own newspapers,
yeah.
much the way the robber barons of this earlier era did. So the parallels there are really striking, and we could talk all morning about that. But
Well, but
yeah,
then the other
so
way that we get the coverage that we're talking about is there is one part of the world that has a deforestation regulation. The EU does not allow materials that are contribute to deforestation in products sold in the continent. That's a very everyday kind of thing, but it's also the kind of thing that the conservative press will say, look at all that regulation. They're not letting you choose.
mhm.
And so what can our readers, for instance, do to support global reporting to give them an accurate view of this kind of an issue, deforestation, which is pretty amorphous from a seeing the trees for the forest perspective.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, I think one thing is just when you find news outlets that are making these connections, that are doing a better job than the establishment press of covering the issues and not just the events, like support them, right?
Hmm.
So, and that can be financial, of course, right? Support them, send them a donation, but it can also be as simple as like subscribe directly to their newsletter.
Yeah.
I think one of the things right now, and I don't want to change our topic here, but the algorithms that I mentioned a moment ago are affecting our news feeds on social platforms like Facebook and Instagram and others, and even on although it seems like an unregulated hell, also on Twitter X. Um, and so subscribing directly to a newsletter is one way of bypassing some of that algorithmic filtering that definitely impacts the kinds of stories that you're likely to see if you're only relying on a social media feed to recommend stories to you. Um,
It will get even more complicated as AI becomes the primary interface through which we interact with information.
yeah, that's exactly right.
Wow. Well, on that happy note, let's turn to the third topic. Al Jazeera, Vatican News, and several other publications have covered the declining access to clean water available to children. About one-third of the children on the planet don't have access to clean water. Can you tell us about a few examples of effective storytelling and reporting that have successfully brought child-focused climate issues into public discourse? I mean, are there good examples, not just examples of cover-ups?
Yeah, well, I mean, I would say, part of that is going to be the reporting that we've covered in this year's book is exemplifies, I think, all the stories, all the reporting that we cover in the top 25 exemplifies, I think, the very best of kind of independent investigative journalism. And those outlets may not be flawless on every topic and every issue, but they are ones that deserve attention and support. Um, this story is based on a UNICEF report, The Climate Change Child, that the basic point of the report is that children are bearing the brunt of the climate crisis,
Mhm.
right? And there is therefore, the UNICEF report sums up a children's rights crisis as a result of this. And so that's, it's interesting to think about how do you cover something like that?
Yeah.
A lot of successful social movements are based on the idea of our kids need a place to play, our kids need safe drinking water, et cetera, et cetera. Um, and yet, this is a story that, it's in our top 25 list this year because no major establishment news outlets in the US have covered this story adequately. They've
Yeah.
covered bits and pieces of it, but they haven't. Um, we say as of May 2024, when this book went to press, no corporate media outlets in the US bothered to break this astonishing news, the UNICEF report about the climate change child. Um, so, I mean, I think one thing is, I would say better coverage, to go back to your question, focusing on solutions. Focusing on solutions. There's solutions journalism is, I think, an incredibly important and increasingly prevalent kind of version of journalism. Um, the idea that responses to problems are newsworthy, which is in effect the slogan of the Solutions Journalism Network, which I would recommend to anyone interested in environmental issues or more broadly. Their Story Tracker, which is an online feature, allows you um, to look by outlet, to look by region, to look by story, theme, and topic. And so, for instance, there's a on the Solutions Journalism's Network Story Tracker, one of the issue areas that you can check and see stories from all different kinds of sources, including some that Project Censored would, probably label as corporate news. But you will get stories, for instance, about clean water, hygiene, and sanitation. And
Hmm.
if you follow that link, you'll come across things like Yes Magazine, talking about examples. If you look at the story tracker, Yes Magazine reporting last year on water apartheid in Gaza. You can also come across an older report about how from the Christian Science Monitor about how atmospheric water generation is a developing technology that can be used to provide clean sanitary water in places that are otherwise experiencing drought. So there are solutions out there. And so this pertains to this story specifically, but I think it also holds more generally. There are solutions out there. But when I was talking earlier about some of the systemic gaps that we see looking back historically at corporate news media, solution stories are often underreported by corporate news outlets. And so they're one of the gaps, I would say. And I think, you know, this is to shift from reporting something that's a simple matter of fact to interpreting the reasons for that. If you think about the corporate news media, is it a useful message for corporate interests? Does it reflect a corporate worldview to regularly feature stories where people in communities are coming together to solve problems on their own? And, the sociologist in me says, oh, there might be a conflict of interest there for the corporate news outlet, that if people suddenly start becoming aware that all over the world, communities of people are banding together and doing this on whatever the issue is that faces them, that can be a catalyst for more of that action. And people may begin to then realize that their lives and their life chances are more in their hands than they might think if they only read the corporate news and see yet another story about how something has gone wrong and the only people capable of fixing it are from outside of the community.
Well, and I think that's the key. And where we have the opportunity for real change is the recognition of our opportunity to self-organize these solutions and move some of these problem-solving efforts back to the community rather than exporting them to
Mhm.
corporations or to global or national government. And I see that a lot in the work that I do as a consultant. There are solutions everywhere. The connection of resources to those solutions is the hard part. We need to take a quick commercial break, but we need to continue this important conversation. We'll be right back. Now, let's get back to the show. We're talking with Andy Lee Roth, editor at large of Project Censored, about the 25 most censored stories of 2024 with a special focus on environmental reporting. So, Andy, the fourth story that we want to talk about, and this was your number 4 story of the year, was how natural gas stoves impact both human health and the environment. And they became a campaign issue in 2024. It was NPR and the Climate Investigation Center broke the story in November 2023. What did they find?
Yeah. The idea, this is kind of a classic Project Censored story, I would say, Mitch.
Mhm.
It's about a decades-long disinformation campaign to convince Americans that having natural gas in your home is not only safe, but like, it'll make you like Julia Childs or whatever the celebrity chef of the day is. So it's a disinformation campaign. We know, and I should add here, Rebecca Lieber of Vox also had important reporting on this. We know that the gas industry, so the natural gas industry, has been using basically tactics drawn from and adapted from the tobacco industry to promote, in this case, not cigarettes and smoking, but to promote the use of natural gas in homes. And the strategic kind of entry point for that was the natural gas stove, which going back to the 70s, we know now, thanks to this investigative reporting, that when you saw Julia Childs, the famous chef, cooking on her stove, it was a natural gas stove. And she might even say something about how the natural gas allowed her to control the burners,
Yeah.
to get a better execution of the recipe that she was working on.
She's an
And that's
influencer. She's one of the
she
first
was an
influencers.
she was an early influence, right? We talk about with Project Censored, we talk about how we were doing critical media literacy before there was a term for it, and Julia Childs was an influencer, a cooking influencer before we had that term too. So, this story did get some coverage as we look at it, but as you noted in the setup for our talking about this story now, the corporate media that covered this story didn't cover the decades-long propaganda campaign to promote gas appliances in households. They focused on this as kind of another chapter in the ongoing cultural war, right?
Yeah.
And the liberals would be coming, not for your gun, but for your gas stove. So there is coverage in this case, but it's coverage that is truly, in the sense I was talking about, partial. It's incomplete and probably biased. Why gas stoves? Part of the marketing strategy was the gas stove was a prominent appliance in the household, right? In the kitchen, a center of gathering.
Well,
But also the
just to,
idea was
just
if
to,
you,
just to interject, the phrase cooking with gas
yeah,
is an advertising slogan from 1959 and
yeah,
1960. I still use it when I'm expressing doing well.
yeah, yeah, right. We're
And,
cooking with
and
gas here. Yeah.
right, and we have to cook with renewable energy. You're talking about the way that we also inject memes into society in a new and different way, or let's say an amplified way. What can we do as readers and potentially in support of various media to turn this lens around and not see it through the lens of the industry, but see it through the lens of the impact of the industry?
Yeah, I love that question. It leads directly to something that my colleague Shaylee Voidal and I have been working on for the last year or so. In media studies, we often talk about framing, the framing of a story, right? And if you think about like a picture frame and how it shapes what you see, and a picture frame focuses our attention on some things and occludes or leaves outside of the picture, as it were, other issues. And so Shaylee Voidal and I have been working on what we call frame checking as an addition to the kind of basic media literacy skill of fact checking. And the idea is, with frame checking, we're interested in stories that are factually accurate, but nonetheless misleading, because the framing of the
Yeah.
story shapes how we interpret and make sense of those
Mm-hmm.
facts. And so one of the things that Shaylee has been working on a lot, partly as a way, partly as a strategic effort to convince young people that this is interesting and worth their time and energy, is looking at the framing of social media influencers' posts.
Yeah.
And so this is everything from recommendations about makeup on platforms like TikTok and Instagram to efforts to recruit people to the military, which isn't, it's not the drill sergeant comes to your gym and challenges people to push-up contests anymore. The recruiting efforts on social media now are being done by very attractive young people who have kind of day in the life of the military videos that they post, where
Yeah.
it looks like sort of like going to summer camp, and other videos, short videos. These are like TikTok style videos, where the idea is I just went on a $500 shopping spree because that I could undertake because of my signing bonus.
All the frills with none of the substance.
Exactly. Or, I traveled the world and paid for my education.
Mm-hmm.
And so it's not that that's a factually incorrect claim, but the framing of it leaves out important things about what it means to serve day to day in the military. And I'll leave that at that for the time being. The point being that some of the tools that we tend to think of, we originally developed the frame checking guide, which is online at the Project Censored website for anyone who's a teacher and wants to use it with their students. It's available. We originally developed that to analyze news stories. But we started getting interested in how framing, of course, isn't limited to journalism. Framing, we're constantly framing things all the time. And social media influencers are definitely using framing to either boost their accounts or drive their followers to certain products. or in the case of the military recruiting, to make someone think about, well, maybe I should sign up. Um, and
Yeah.
so, yeah, I think if we're talking about natural gas story, stoves were the centerpiece. You could have celebrity chefs and influencers all using gas stoves, which isn't a very expensive thing, but it's incredibly
Mhm.
influential. And then in terms of the business interests of the industry, once you have a gas stove, you're more likely to put in a gas powered furnace, a gas
Yep.
powered water heater, a gas powered clothes dryer. And the knock on effects of that in terms of industry profits has been huge. And that's part of this reporting on this story, too.
And climate impacts as well. Your number three story also focused on water, the intrusion of salt water into drinking water supplies along the coast because of rising sea levels. The Guardian and The Conversation cover this story, but tell us, why is saltwater intrusion, despite this potentially devastating impact on millions of people, millions of Americans, not a more visible part of the climate infrastructure coverage that we should be talking about right now?
I think this is another one where we can talk about like events versus issues, or what happened today versus what happens every day, right?
Mhm.
So our story process is, going back to an earlier moment in our conversation today, our story process involves kind of year-long vetting of stories that culminates in judges who are media experts, voting to help us, giving their input, and then ultimately voting to help us rank the stories. And one of our judges um, is a retired professor named Robert Hackett, who talks in a book called The Missing News, which was kind of like Project Censored, focused on Canada. Hackett is Canadian. Um, he talks about how corporate media are very good at covering what happened today, but not good at covering what happens every day, right? So this is down to value, down to definitions of news value and news judgment based on those definitions. And
Yep.
so this story, we did have coverage of saltwater intrusion in the fall of 2023. So to back up, saltwater intrusion is a problem because, as the reporting that we feature in the yearbook talks about, can wreak havoc on farmlands, ecosystems, and livelihoods. Um, in the fall of 2023, saltwater intrusion was briefly a major issue for corporate news outlets. Saltwater intrusion from the Gulf of Mexico, and I'll use that term advisedly, the Gulf of Mexico was coming up the Mississippi River and infiltrating freshwater systems in the Delta region, contaminating drinking water, messing up with agricultural water supplies, and also damaging inland ecosystems. So there was news coverage of that. But as soon as the saltwater line backed down to its normal level, the coverage disappeared, except for local news outlets saying, "Hey, it was a blip. We're back to normal. No need to worry."
Well,
The story
that's
that
your
we,
point. That's the point about news judgment too. Thinking about it as the thing that happens every day. Another community's water was impacted by salination.
Mhm.
Doesn't play well compared to tourist submarine off the coast of Egypt sinks. 9 died.
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so we don't get the opportunity to see these stories because they are incremental rather than momentous.
Exactly. And also in this case, like very specific to this story, the salt line, as it's known, which is the zone where fresh inland water meets salty seawater, the salt line naturally moves back and forth to some degree. And single events like floods and storms can push it further out. Um, right. But the point here, and this is the climate kickers on this story and why it's in our top 25 list, is that with climate change, rising seas are gradually pulling the salt line in. And this is affecting coastal communities all over the United
Yep.
States and around the world. And as that salt line comes in, it's not just affecting coastal communities, it's all the kind of what happens upstream, as it were. Um,
Mhm.
and so this is a major story. And it's pretty shocking to see that other than that brief period in fall of 2023, when it was a kind of an event-worthy crisis, the reports, the studies that this story is based on have been basically ignored, right? The idea that, like, okay, we're going to have more of these more often, which sounds familiar if we talk
Yep.
about like extreme weather events associated with climate. Here's another variation on that theme: saltwater intrusion with all its implications for drinking water, agriculture, inland ecosystems.
Yeah, we ignored extreme weather as it grew from 1/10 of what it is today because it was just another event rather than a process that you could clearly articulate as in a short story. Because another of the curses of our time is that are a lot of editors who think, nobody's going to read more than 800 words. And these are
Yeah.
stories that take real time. And that brings me to the last story. The World Resources Institute and others have reported about the vicious cycle of debt that is preventing many countries in the global south from responding to climate change. And of course, given the United States retreat from foreign aid, how can journalists start to tell this story in a way that has an impact on Americans so that we potentially return to partnering with the world to dealing with the problems that our industrial economy has created?
And that's a heavy task for journalism to carry all by its lonesome.
Well,
But
somebody's got to do it. If the other estates give
I
up,
know, right? I mean,
step
yeah,
up.
no, another of our judges, Nicholas Johnson, who's a former FCC commissioner, in addition to being a retired communications professor, Nick always talks about your second priority, and he wrote a book with that title, actually. And what he means by that is that whatever your key issue of concern is, your first priority, so the climate crisis, systemic police violence, you name it. Whatever your first priority is, your second priority better be media reform and basically press freedom,
Yeah.
because without that, you're unlikely to make any progress on your first priority, right? And so this is a kind of I think a Nick Johnson, your second priority story. This story is again, this is truly like, this is not something like we can point to everyday impacts of this vicious circle of climate debt. The thing that stands out for me is the idea. So the World Resources Institute is the source of the study that the journalism that we celebrate was based on. And one of their findings was that, so if we talk about the world's most vulnerable, climate vulnerable nations, and we say there are 50 most vulnerable nations, 23 of those 50 most climate vulnerable nations are either in debt distress or they're this close to being in debt distress. And debt distress is the term used meaning they're unable to repay the principal and the interest owed to the creditors.
Yep.
And this is an issue in so-called developing countries, because it's incredibly expensive to be climate resilient,
Hmm.
right? It requires immense national budgets. And one of the first things to get cut in an impoverished country are kind of the climate resilience programs. So, and then the vicious cycle that we're talking about. And so this is something I don't understand. Like, in answer to your question, I don't understand why this story can't get more traction than it has. And partly Project Censored is trying to make more people aware of it, is because these nations have extreme debt that they can't even keep up with the interest on the debt, they begin cutting basic social programs. That in turn leads to public distrust in government. There's further impoverishment. The country's credit ratings go down, and
Then
it
they
is
turn to
true that this.
austerity, and that reduces economic resilience. I mean, the whole thing just unravels, and we're doing it
Yeah,
even to ourselves at this point.
I think that's true. Yes. Um, it's so, I mean, I think one of the recommendations of the study was that we need to be doing more to help these debt distressed countries maintain their climate programs and basic social services. And it's perhaps in a kind of global interest to do so, because it's not good overall when countries dissolve into chaos, right? It's obviously not good for the citizens of those countries and the way it impacts their lives. but it's also bad on a global scale as well. And you could argue that, okay, well, there's a version of capitalism that thrives on and profits from that disorder. But I think, this is one of these stories that exemplifies kind of what is maybe the theme of our conversation this morning, right? Because there's not any single one dramatic instance. Reporters then have to figure out, well, how do you dramatize a story that's about grinding inequality, right? And how do you make that story palatable to an audience whose national government is implicated in these very in the very policies that are the source of these of this suffering?
Andy, you've been very generous with your time. I want to ask one last question, which is, what do you see as the emerging climate stories that we should be following, and what publications would you recommend that folks track in
Oh
order to
yeah,
keep?
this is so great. Well, I mean, on the downside, we're seeing literally just this morning, the scientist who first identified what we know colloquially as acid rain, warning that under the current kind of purge of science, funding for research and attacks on federal science organizations, that we're probably going to see a return of so-called acid rain in a way that we thought we didn't have to face again. So this, I feel like this is like the climate version of what we're hearing about things like measles and polio.
Mhm.
On a more positive note, journalism has a role to play here. You know, the Trump administration purged a tool that had been created by FEMA to help people assess the costs of climate change, not just
Yep.
in the abstract, but as affecting their regions and their communities. That tool was purged, but The Guardian reported yesterday, I think, working with data scientists, they've recreated that tool, and they've what the federal government under the current administration won't make publicly available, they have.
This is a really interesting point because this is an area I've been thinking a lot about as people see these federal databases abandoned. You can restore it to what it was, but you can't update it without further funding, which is what the government was providing. Are there opportunities for us to do so as the public, or to work with philanthropic leaders to recreate and then continue to update these databases?
I mean, I suppose that's out of my area of expertise, or I lack my crystal ball.
Are
But
there
I think in
organizations that
principle,
would be interested in it, do you think?
oh, I think so. And I mean, I think the demand is huge, right? I mean, the hard thing is, like, so the recreation of this FEMA tool, like, most people didn't even know about this. And
Yeah.
the scientists who created it had kind of soft pedaled it in anticipation of the fact that it was probably going to be targeted, if not taken down. And so that's part of the problem, right? Is, I think, again, public awareness. And I think one of the big challenges, I haven't thought this through myself. My training is as a sociologist. I think, and 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 I think there's a real importance to the Marxist concept of false consciousness, the idea that we've been led to believe that our interests are different than they are. And it's a point of internal wrestling for me. You can't just tell someone false consciousness, dude. Like, no one wants to hear that. That's not going to be how you win any arguments. But I think one of our challenges is to figure out, how do we convince people that positions they've held passionately, that they are willing to double down on again and again, may be contrary to their self-interest. That's the challenge I'm thinking about all the time now. Because I think, like, I'm a big believer in the critical media literacy programs that Project Censored champions. And I think they have the potential to change people's minds. And we see that happening in classrooms with young people who start out never having heard of Julian Assange. And after they dig on a story about the persecution of Assange, and whether should be considered a journalist or not, or whether he's simply a publisher, and what kind of protections, you see how that can change people's
Yeah.
thinking. And that's exciting. But I think, these are uphill into the wind battles. Talking about, you mentioned publications. Um, that are worth looking at. This is semi-idiosyncratic, so this isn't Project
That's
Censored
fine.
speaking now. This
Everybody
is
has to make some
this is
choices.
Andy. This is Andy speaking here. I love High Country News.
Hmm.
I think they put out a beautiful magazine, a beautiful print magazine every month. They're online too, but like you can subscribe to High Country News and you'll get an amazing, beautiful magazine sent to you every month. I don't know how they do it on a monthly basis. I think, and they do a lot of climate coverage and they do a lot of interesting climate coverage. I mentioned the Solutions Journalism Network earlier. Um, I think in terms of climate, online, DSmog is worth having a look at. Drilled is another interesting site. Um, I I am friends with and a fan of the work done by the good folks at Weave News. And Weave, they're interesting. The weave in Weave News is the weave between global and local issues.
Hmm.
And so they don't report exclusively on climate crisis, but when they do, it's always through that distinct perspective of connecting the global to the local. So they talk about global coverage. Um, I think The Conversation is another place that does consistently interesting reporting. The Conversation provides a platform for university professors, researchers who are not themselves journalists to do journalistic-like reporting.
Hmm.
So it's translational in the sense of it's often taking a study that a professor or a researcher has conducted or been part of and turning it into kind of a news story that's easy to understand, that doesn't require like accessing a professional peer-reviewed academic journal. And then I would say, I mean, I think programs like yours, Mitch, Earth 911, like
Thank you.
shout out to what you do. It's really important and it's a way that people can get information and perspective that they're not maybe otherwise going to come across. And I think that's really valuable. And I want to give you a shout out for the work you do in this way.
Aw shucks. But Andy, thank you because you've shed light on a lot of things, including opportunities for getting a better view of what's going on in the world. I want to thank you for the time today. It's been fascinating.
Thanks, Mitch.
You've been listening to a conversation with the editor at large of Project Censored, Andy Lee Roth, about the underreported environmental stories of 2023 and 2024. And you can learn more and follow a host of links to background information about all the stories we discussed and more at projectcensored.org. That's one word, no space, no dash, projectcensored.org. The fact that environmental stories dominate Project Censored's list is an indication of where we are as a society, despite clear, incontrovertible evidence that human-generated CO2 emissions are causing the planet to warm beyond the temperatures in which humans evolved and thrived. The extractive, single-use industries that dominated the 20th century are pushing back harder than ever in a desperate attempt to survive until, well, at last, there's no nature left to save. Now, unfortunately, we face explicit censorship of climate-related information in the United States. But the abandonment of regulations, support for objective science, and investments in green alternatives can be the last gasp of industrial resistance to change if Americans, and citizens of all nations, insist on complete reporting that gives them the facts they need to vote for environmental responsibility. The Trumpist gambit, which is already seeing its frayed and fraying logic fall apart in the face of reality, will lead to the make or break moment when the United States is going to be confronted with the existential question about whether or not we can turn this society to a sustainable and regenerative future. And we're going to need plenty of journalism, journalists, and active readers and viewers to spread the word. Andy's comments about the importance of everyone coming to an understanding of Media Literacy 101, as he described it, that is, the simple act of questioning carefully the information we find in the media, is our catalyst for change. Granted, the complexity of media is always increasing, but that doesn't mean that we cannot embrace the practices of seeing through the incomplete and often one-sided messages that we encounter hundreds of times a day. Just asking, what's the scientific basis of this climate claim? Or is the impact of nature described in this article or TikTok video These questions can start each of us on a journey of discovery that can ultimately change the course of society. Change starts with us, even in an era when we are told that only great men can steer society in a new direction. In fact, it's citizens of the planet, who are the ultimate arbiters of value, values, and policy, because we pay for the future, and the cost of failing to make progress falls on all of us. So, I hope you take some time to visit projectcensored.org to find the independent media that you can count on. And would you take a moment to look at other episodes of Sustainability in Your Ear? We've got more than 500 shows to share with your friends, your family, your coworkers. If you take a moment to write a review on your favorite podcast platform, it will help your neighbors find us. Folks, you're the amplifiers who can spread more ideas to create less waste. So, tell everyone they can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or whatever purveyor of podcast goodness they prefer. Thank you for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Sustainability in Your Ear, and we will be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.